Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. And today we're going to talk about go to sleep in the endgame. This is an idea that I talked about in earlier videos, especially some like queen against pawn on the 7th rank. So this is a little bit of a follow-up on that, but it can stand independently. The idea of go to sleep in your endgame is to put a piece in such a way that you really don't have to think much anymore. You can just do everything automatically and not really worry too much about what your opponent's doing. And in the previous video with queen against pawn on the 7th rank, we saw that if the queen could get in front of the pawn on the 7th rank, then you're in a go to sleep position. So I'm going to use this video to show pawns on the 6th rank and some various things like that to show you. And I'll do a puzzle with the pawn on the 7th rank as well, and then we'll talk about maybe doing it with things other than the queen. All right, so in this position, it's white to play and win. And the general rule is if the pawn's on the 6th rank, then white is always winning, and it's not really that hard. With the 7th rank, we talked about the fact that knight pawns and center pawns are wins. If the defending king is helping the pawn get a queen, bishop pawns and rook pawns are draws. But with 6th rank, it's always a loss. So the one way to do it is to always force the king in front of the pawn and then bring the king up. And we're going to do it first, that method, and then we're going to show you how we could do the GTS, go to sleep in the endgame. All right, so the method to force him in front, we would start with something like queen d6 check, and then the king does not want to go in front of the pawn. That's the worst place to go, because then every time you go in front of the pawn, the king comes up. So the king tries to go somewhere else. Let's say he goes to e2, hoping to just keep pushing the pawn. Then white would zigzag the queen closer, forking the king and the pawn. The king would go there, threatening to bring the pawn up, and now you check here, and this is the basic position. There's no possibility of any stalemates with the pawn on the 6th rank. And now if the king doesn't want to lose the pawn, he'd have to go in front of the pawn. That's your signal to bring the king up. King here, and now the king would go somewhere to try to come up. Well, king to b2 is silly because he's pinning his own pawn, and then you could bring the king up again. So he's going to play something like king to b3 to do that. And now there's a various and sundry ways we can get him in front of the pawn. The best way is to pin it just like we did in the other video with the pawn on the 7th. The king would have to go here to try to threaten to bring the pawn up. We check him here. Again, he doesn't want to go in front. Let's say he goes to the side like that. Now the idea is to simply go behind the pawn, queen here. That's the hard move to find because it's not a check. But now you're threatening to take the pawn. He has to guard it. You check him again. He has to go in front, and you keep bringing the king up. And you just do this until you win the pawn. And this will always work with a pawn on the 6th rank. So king here, we pin it. He goes there. We come across with a check. He comes over here. We say, let me just take your pawn. That's not a check. That's the hard move to find. But once you understand this idea, it's not that hard. King here. Queen checks. King in the way. Bring the king up again. King here. Pins. King down. Check. King here. Queen attacks. King here. Queen checks. King goes in the way. And now we attack the pawn. On the next move, we take it off and we win. Just make sure you don't stalemate him. You know, if he comes up, king back, make sure queen takes pawn or king takes pawn is not stalemate. It's not. Queen takes. King here. In this position, you have lots of ways you can force him to the back rank. Queen checks. King here. Queen over here. King away. King here. King here. King here. Here. Checkmate.
Checkmate.
May even be a faster one. All right, so that takes a little bit of time, but it's very easy. You don't want to let that pawn go to the 7th rank because it's a C pawn, and as we saw in the video on queen against pawn on the 7th rank, if you let the C pawn get to the 7th rank and the offensive king is far enough away, which it is here, then it's going to be a draw. And in fact, we'll look at that in a minute with the review. Is there any other way that white could have won this game a little easier? And the answer is, well, I'm not sure it's easier, but it's faster, and that is to use go to sleep. If I can just get my queen to the c1 square, I can win the game. Well, the obvious try is to play queen b1 check, but after king here, he's threatening to push the pawn, and you can't get your queen to the c1 square, so that's not the most efficient way to do it. The right move here, believe it or not, is to play the queen to the second rank. Queen here, which blocks the king from coming here. If the king doesn't go, if the pawn isn't pushed here and the king makes any move, then we have a GTS position. Queen C2, go to sleep. Now all we have to do is forget about the king can't attack the queen, the pawn can't attack the queen can never be put into Zugzwang with the king on the board. So the queen can just stay there forever. This is the basic GTS position. We just bring our king up and we Zugzwang him away from the pawn. He has to go away. Bye-bye, Mr. King. We take the pawn and we mate him with a king and a queen. So queen h2, we just saw that if he doesn't move the pawn, then he's going to be blocked with queen to c2. So what happens if he does move the pawn? Well, we want to get to c1, but we don't want to stop the king from stopping us from going to c1. So the right move here is not something like queen to g1 when he plays here and threatens the queen. And now we actually have probably reached a drawn position because he has a pawn on the 7th that's a c pawn, a bishop pawn with the king guarding it with the other king sufficiently far away is a draw. So that would be a big blunder. The right move is queen to f4. That stops the king from guarding the promotion square, but it threatens to GTS him, go to sleep with queen to c1. And after he plays king here, let's say queen c1, and then we just bring our king up as before, and we win the pawn very easily here. Okay, so if we go back to the start, so we see the method of checking him and forcing him in front of the pawn and bringing the king up will win. But even easier is the go to sleep method. Block the king from coming to the 7th rank, force the pawn there, stop the king from preventing the queen from going to c1, and GTS. So both those methods will win here. All right, let's review a puzzle I like to show people which illustrates the point about the pawn on the 7th rank. Suppose the pawn's already on the 7th rank, and let's put the king on f6, and we'll put the queen on f8. Okay, so in this position it's white to play and win. Well, we know with bishop pawns it's usually a draw if the king is preventing if the king is guarding the pawn and it's preventing the queen from coming down. And the normal moves here of checking him around don't work, and I think we showed this earlier, but let's do it again. We showed it, I think, in the other video. Queen checks, and king here, threatening to get a queen. Again, he does not want to ever go in front of that pawn if he doesn't have to. And now, queen checks, king here, queen checks, king here. And now, if we keep checking forever, we're not going to make any progress. So we have to go here at some point. And that forces the king to d1, and now we check, and if he goes king e1, we take the pawn and we win. So he has to go in front of the pawn, and we bring the king up. And now he brings the king over here and threatens to get a queen again. We do the same maneuver we did earlier in the video with first we pin it, then we come across with a check. And now the best defense is to play here to see if he understands that to make progress he has to do a non-checking move. So king to a2. If we go king to a1, queen c3 check is still the right move, but it's a check, so weaker players will find it much more easily. So queen here, king here, queen check, and now if we can get him to go in front of the pawn, we win. King's close enough when we win. The problem is he plays king to a1. And now how does white make progress? If he takes the pawn, it's an immediate stalemate. If he moves the king up, then black will get a queen, and it's a draw. If he checks him with the queen, the king will keep threatening to promote the pawn. And it's a draw. So in this position, queen to d6 check is a draw. But can white win? Well, he can't win with forcing the king in front of the pawn because his king's too far away and it's a bishop pawn. And as I said earlier, bishop pawns and rook pawns draw when they're on the 7th rank. The offensive king is far enough away and the defensive king is threatening to help get the pawn promote. But in this position, because the king is one square too far away, what we need to do is circle the square where we can GTS him, circle the pawn, the square where the king can go to guard it, and see if there's any moves we have with the queen that guard both those squares. Well, there's lots of squares on the board that guard both those squares, but in the current position, I can only get to one of them. And the only one I can get to is Queen H6. So believe it or not, we could ask the computer, Queen H6 is the only winning move. After Queen H6, King to C3, Queen C1, go to sleep in the endgame. All right, let's ask Stockfish. Let's make the board smaller. Analysis. Stockfish, are you going to make me a liar? No. Okay, good. I always hated when I show a position to my student and I say, let's ask the computer if I'm right. And the computer says, no, there's something clever here that you missed. But no, Stockfish says, if you start coming down and checking, or you check here, or whatever, second best move, third best move, those checks are all draws. But if you do the GTS move, Queen H6, then you have mate in 10. All right, we'll make the board bigger again. So now we know that you're always trying to do this GTS stuff. All right, so let's create some random position. We'll put the pawn way back on the 4th rank this time. And here there's a big distance from the pawn queening here. And that means it's very easy for me to get my queen in front of the pawn here. So all I have to do here is play like check. And again, he doesn't want to go in front of the pawn. So let's say he goes there, and I do another check. If he goes too far away, I can just put my queen on the c file and win the pawn. But if he brings the king up, I can play something like queen here threatening queen c1, and there's no defense. If he pushes the pawn, I just go here, GTS. If I had started on a different position, I could have played queen here, and then played queen. He could still play king here, but then I'd take the pawn. So I have a double threat. I'm not threatening to take the pawn, but I'm threatening to go to c1, and every move he has that stops me from playing queen c1 is bad. Let's put the queen on a different starting square. Let's say I start on b8. Right, then I simply play queen here and then queen here. Let's put the king on a little better square. Let's say the king is here. How can white do it? Well, white simply says check. Would you like to go away from your pawn where I can win it, or would you like to guard your pawn, in which case I can GTS you? So here, black's between a rock and a hard place. If he plays king d1, I'll play queen c3 and win the pawn. If he guards the pawn, I play queen c1, and then I just march my king up. I don't care whether he pushes the pawn anymore. I'm going to zugzwang him away. Let's just do that to show you. Queen c1. Let's say he decides not to push the pawn. King here. I could even come up one now to lower the number of squares he can go to. King here. I could do the same thing, or I could just bring the king up. King here, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here. I'm running him out of moves. King here. Now I would make sense to bring the queen up, because if I bring the king closer, he'll go there. Not that it really matters. For instance, king here, king here, king here. If he pushes the pawn, I play king here and I win. King d4. If he puts the king back over here, queen takes c4 check, looks good. So these kind of positions cause no problems at all. By the way, the general rule is when someone has multiple pawns, and let's say they have a king over here and you have a king over here, put it over here, and you're trying to stop these two pawns, which piece is better equipped to come in front of these pawns and stop it? Well, you might think the queen is a much more powerful piece, but actually, without the king, you really can't win. So if you just try to start checking with the queen a million times, it doesn't do that much. But once you put the king in front, he can't simultaneously push the pawns and bring his king up. If he brings the king up and you block him with the king, and then he starts pushing the pawns, well, it's pretty easy to stop him here. You could just play, I don't know, everything wins. Queen here, pawn up, queen here. He's running into zugzwang already. Let's say he plays here. I could move my king up. He can't even check me because it's pinned. King here. Everything wins here. Queen here, let's say. King here, queen check, and then we take off the two pawns. And that's not the only way to do it. You could pretty much blunder around it. The key in these kind of positions is to realize you want the king in front of the pawns. If you try to keep... I see beginners all the time. They start checking a million checks with the queen, and they wonder why they can't make any progress. Well, the king and the queen can easily stop the king and the two pawns, but it's not so easy for the queen itself. The queen itself can stop two pawns in a lot of situations, but it's a little harder. But with the king in front, it's trivial. So why make it hard for yourself? Just bring the king up. Now let's talk about whether we can do a GTS without the queen. So let's just go back and review. The main GTS idea is to get, when there's only one pawn, is to get the queen somewhere in front of the pawn on any of the squares in front. So queen here, if king here, queen check, king here, and then we'll just leave the queen here while we bring the king up, and there's nothing he can do to us. Is there any other kind of endgame thing that's anything like that? Well, you can tie him up with protected passed pawns, for instance, or you could tie him up with a knight and a pawn. For instance, suppose black has a couple pawns over here, like this, and white has a king far away, and the black king's down here. But let's say white has a pawn on the rook pawn, and he's guarding it with a knight that's behind the pawn. Okay, so this is a little bit like a GTS, because black can never take the pawn, and in this position, he can't take the knight because the pawn queens, which gives white plenty of time to bring the king up and set up a mating attack. So king up, king here, king up, king here, king up. Again, white doesn't have to worry. Once he gets this set up, he doesn't have to worry about doing anything. King here, king here, king here. Here's the key square. If you can get your knight to f7, you get a queen. The king could have also come over and picked off these pawns. How do we get our knight there? Well, there's lots of paths to get to that square. One of them is through g5. We can get the g5 by going g3 here. So knight here, king here, knight here, king here, knight here, king here, check, here, check, queen. What else could we have done? Well, I guess we could have been fancy here. Instead of playing all those knight moves, we could have played knight here right away. And now, if he takes my knight, we get a queen on the c-file. So if he goes in the corner, we can now check him here right away, and then check, and then we get a queen and we win. All right, so is there another way we could do this? Well, we could do this if we had two pawns. If we have two pawns, he can never take the back pawn. And that means my king can either come over here and help the pawns, or I can come over the other side of the board and pick off the pawns. So that's sort of a GTS idea. Let's look at one where black blunders into a GTS. So let's say black has a king here, and we'll give him an extra pawn. Let's see, where can we put the pawn? How about pawn here for the fun of it? Not sure how well this works. All right, let's get rid of the king here. Let's bring the pawn up to here. Put a black pawn here. All right, let's make this black to play. Well, black has a protected passed pawn here, which looks pretty strong, and that's causing a GTS for the white king. So what black should be able to do is play something like king here, and if white tries to get a queen, you just take, come over and get the pawn, and you win. Because white's the one who's got the GTS problems. He's the one whose king can never really get this pawn right away. But suppose black gets hasty and pushes g6. Then white could get the protected passed pawn, and when black goes behind it, he can't come around this way because white will just queen. Now the question is, can white bring his king up and get behind these pawns and take these pawns before this pawn becomes a queen? Well, let's see if he can. All right, so king to b2, obviously pushing this pawn right away is ridiculous. So he'll play king to f7. We can't push this pawn because he'll just go over and take it. So king here, king here, king here, king here, king here. All right, so because of black being stuck with this pawn, notice the white pawn that's passed is much, much closer to being a queen, which is greatly in white's advantage. This is one case where, quote, space is very helpful. Space being the distance between your pawns and where they started. And here, white has a lot more space, even though he's not using it to get activity for the rest of his army. He's using it to get queening threats. Well, if black plays king to g8, king here, he still can't push this pawn because I'll come over and take it. But But if he plays king up to f8, I'll play here, and now he'll run with me. Pawn here, king takes, pawn here. But white can play king here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here. Just in time, queen, check, king up, and now we can go to the b file, take the pawn, and win easily. So in this position, black should never, ever, ever push this pawn here. He should just go after the white pawns, and then white's in trouble. So if it's black's move here, Mr. Stockfish, is black just winning with king to e6? We'll ask him to figure it out. Stockfish says, of course. Does he have any other moves that win? Can he win with king to e7, for instance? Stockfish says, yes, he can. Can he win with king to g8? Third best move. b5. Wow, b5 wins right away? That's hard to believe. I didn't think he could give up this pawn and still win. So you see that black's winning in a lot of these cases. Let's, before he made that terrible blunder. So let's change the position a little bit. Let's make this pawn a backward pawn instead. Let's move the black pawns up one. And we'll put a pawn at b7 so he doesn't have that GTS kind of threat like this. Okay, now black should be okay as long as he goes right after the pawns again. He may even still be winning. Probably not quite as easily. Stockfish says, if white plays, white wins. All right, how about if black plays? Black plays, still white's winning. Interesting. All right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to play that blunder again. We're going to play that g6 move, h6, and now the black king is stuck in the corner. And now white simply can bring his king up here and take off all the pawns and win the game. So this is a little bit like that same kind of GTS idea. You're just using a piece to tie him up so you don't have to worry about anything. So we've seen different ways that you can do that now. We've seen when you have a protected passed pawn, he can't move his king away from that area. We've seen if you protect the pawn, let's say with a knight, if you put it on the 7th rank, it doesn't work. But if the pawn's on the 6th rank or below, and you have this kind of position where white's threatening to get a queen, black can never take the knight because the pawn queens, but he can never take the pawn because the knight's guarding it, which gives you all the time in the world you want to do whatever you want. And all the time in the world to do whatever you want with your other pieces is that GTS idea. And we're assuming that black doesn't have a lot of pieces on the board where he can do whatever he wants, and all he can really do is sit there and, stop the pawn from promoting. So that's pretty much what he's going to do. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. We have that earlier video, as I said, on queen against pawn on the 7th rank, which sort of goes along with this one. If you liked the video, you can like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can. Best thing you can do is tell your friends about the channel. And we will see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.